All right, Rahul, thanks for being here. This is great.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat.
So software engineering has been a tremendous part of my experience. I also went through the path of taking internships as an undergrad, and then sort of like being funneled into the pipeline of big tech, and feeling like a citizen in big tech, and navigating those decisions and learning these technologies, and learning internal ways of doing things, not just technologies, but workflows, performance reviews, and like quarterly cycles and sprints and whatnot. And everybody has their own way of doing it. But that was a tremendously formative experience for me. And I thought it would be amazing to have a chance to talk about this aspect of life with you, not only because you have sort of made a name for yourself discussing these issues, but also because we share a lot of common sort of like patterns in life. Like we both were section leaders and involved in CS education. We have very common dear friends, and common other life connections like Branner and the RFs and that type of stuff. So thank you for taking the time to be here. It really means a lot. Why don't we start with your first forays into big tech, and like go back to that time with the impressionable young Rahul?
Yeah,
What
I
was
mean,
that like?
it had to be like at Stanford, probably similar to you, right? Like I grew up in Michigan, so didn't really have too much exposure to big tech, let alone the whole tech industry. In middle school or high school, my dad was in the auto industry, so I came out to Stanford, and it becomes very clear when you spend any amount of time on campus, especially if you're taking computer science classes, that um, there's a lot of money to be made and a lot of prestige and a lot of job security and future opportunity if you're able to get into one of these big tech companies, right? And so when you go to the career fair, it's pretty clear, right? There's a select few companies which have a huge line. Tons of people want to go talk to the recruiter or engineers there, and those might change uh, year by year, because then I'm not just talking about
Mhm.
the mega big tech like Google, Microsoft, Meta. I'm also talking about things like when I was in college, it was, you know, Dropbox was super hot. And I think,
Mhm.
you're a few years younger, but like Palantir was also very hot for a while there, Quora, right? And so those things might evolve, but there are always these certain companies that, yeah, they have a magnetism around them that Stanford students are just super attracted to.
So that was, I completely agree. That was the energy, and you're sort of, there's like this very techie hacker culture that I think was the product of like the 2010s, like the Social Network, and these movies that were sort of like I don't know, like pedestalizing the founder's journey and the startup ecosystem, and like the innovative spirit to like change the world. Um, and you're right. And then there's like these companies that have these magnetisms and big lines around them. I totally forgot about the career fairs. So you just mentioned that right now, but that's a whole experience to live. It's like going to a carnival where like it's all like tech companies that are trying to recruit you, and they're all speaking like in very particular lingos, um, and so that's fascinating. And I was definitely in that place. I was in the place where I was like, I didn't even really know which one to apply to, so I applied to everything.
Yeah.
And in my case, it happened that the funnel worked out to be Google, and I'm really happy that that's how it ended up working for me. What was that like for you?
Yeah, it definitely was a journey, because I feel like I came in and frankly, I had tons of imposter syndrome because I didn't really have any coding background. And I remember like two dorms down from me in my freshman year in Robley, because I was in West Log. And so
Hmm.
Robley was a couple dorms down. And uh, one of the other freshmen who I met was the youngest certified Java programmer in the world. He had like gotten certified. It was like literally a world record. He had gotten certified as a Java programmer at like 10 years and 9 months. Um,
No,
and so
no.
and I felt like I came in. I was like, I definitely didn't have any knowledge of programming languages or anything really to do with computers. At age 10, uh, and so like I felt very much out of my element, and it took me a while. I think I had a really hard time getting any callbacks, even for the first few career fairs, the first few years. And I think like the way I would categorize it was at that period, there were a group of students who really they had this hacker mentality that you mentioned, and it felt like they could just do anything. And I definitely didn't feel like I was part of that cohort of people. Like for example, one concrete example comes to mind of someone made YT Instant, YouTube Instant, which is a play off of Google Instant at the time. So I don't know if you remember, like in 2011, I
Mm.
believe, there was this thing called Google Instant, which as you typed, it would show you different search results. And so this person, Faraz, a friend of mine, made YT Instant, went viral, and like got picked up in a bunch of publications. He got offered a job at YouTube as like this, 19, 20-year old. And I would consider him and a bunch of other people as like the true hacker mentality. They could go out, build a tool or a startup and get funding for it. I felt like I didn't belong there. And so,
Mhm.
My mentality was, given that I still need to learn a lot, I need to get a bunch of experience. I need to prove to myself and other people that I can actually build things. I was frankly in the mode of collecting credentials. That's kind of how I thought about it.
Mhm. Mhm.
I made it at Stanford. That's a big deal. Like most people have heard of
Mhm.
Stanford. It's a well-known computer science program. But for me, I felt like I need to keep adding in more and more so I can prove to myself and other people that I deserve it and I can actually kind of keep progressing my career. And so for me, it always was starting, as soon as I kind of figured that out, the goal was, let me go get an internship in big tech. And so I actually
Mhm.
applied for a Google or Facebook internship in freshman year, got rejected. I did it again my sophomore year, second year, got rejected. Did it again my third year, got rejected. And then finally, in my fourth year, my last year of undergrad, I finally got an internship offer from Facebook. And so the summer between my undergrad and my master's degree,
Mhm.
after 4 years at Stanford, I finally landed that big tech internship. And that did, I think, open up a ton of opportunity. Because once you have the
Mhm.
Stanford brand of stamp of approval, you have the Facebook stamp of approval, then I think, Silicon Valley is your
Mhm.
oyster. You can do whatever you want. And that's kind of the starting off of my career journey.
I mean, and I feel the same way. And it's funny that you mentioned the credentialism or I've always thought of it like credentialist arbitrage. You're arbitraging the current set of credentials for the next one. And that's how you
Mm,
sort of build the story where you're sort of like, okay, I think I'm doing well because the story makes sense and it's progressing at the rate and rhythm that I want. And I want to get to how, the reassessment of that mode of being happens later on. But before, um, what was the first internship like? What was your team? What was that? Like how did you find yourself navigating this gigantic entity that is Facebook?
yeah. So you're talking about the Facebook internship or the first internship I had after my freshman year at Stanford?
No, 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 the Facebook internship.
Okay, okay, yeah. So I think the Facebook internship, it was actually probably the best internship by far I had. And I think that came because of the scale and the history and the kind of the benefits of working at Facebook. They knew what they were doing, right? They had a very
Hmm.
well-oiled machine when it came to recruiting a bunch of smart interns at top universities, giving them free food, free technology, like a bunch of smart people, and then putting them and saying, hey, go work on actual important stuff, not internal tools, not something that'll never ship, but actually things that'll impact users. And so I think that there was some amount of just like awe or overwhelm of just like there's so many smart people here. I want to go to the gym. I want to go get the free food. I want to go talk to my coworkers. And I also, by the way, need to do legitimate work in order to secure a return internship. So
Hmm.
that's kind of like what I would say is my initial reaction when I
Hmm.
first few days of the internship. Just like there's too much going on. Um, I think the other thing too is that I think compared to other internships I had, it was very clear that this is like a very well defined project with a well defined mentor who would kind of handhold me through whatever I was doing. And I think the Facebook internship was the first summer where I was treated like a real engineer. Like, hey, here's this
Hmm.
somewhat well scoped problem, but it's up to you to figure out who do you talk to, and what technology are you going to use to actually solve that problem. So, for example, at Facebook, they use this thing called Hack, which is a derivative of PHP. I had
Hmm.
never written a line of Hack in my life. And I think freshman year Rahul or sophomore year Rahul would have been terrified of like, there's no way I can not only learn a language in a summer, but also ship production level code in that language. There's no way.
Mhm.
But I feel like with Facebook, there's almost this expectation that, hey, we're going to throw you in and we think you're going to be able to handle it. Like you're going to quickly ramp up, read the documentation, ask for help if you need it. But then it's up to you
Mhm.
to figure out how to do it. And I feel like that expectation of independence um, led me to actually become more independent. And I was able
Mhm.
to then, eventually after a few weeks of floundering, I felt like now I get it and I can actually ship code and I can be productive as a normal engineer. I don't need that much, spoon feeding from a mentor.
Mhm. And it goes to, I think it speaks volumes about the level of sophistication and best practices that these companies have developed
Yeah.
for these types of programs, these types of onboarding exercises, these types of honestly just culturation methods where you start sort of like trying to assimilate to this way of doing things,
Yeah.
and that everything from like there's not just say like the programming language hack, but there's like the stylistic conventions on top of hack. This is how we this is our flavor of the flavor that we have. And then there's like all the etiquette around like code reviews and the figuring out not just how to write the code, but how to chunk the code and how to present those to the right stakeholders so that they approve it in time so that you meet your deadlines. And so there's a lot of like internal project management that goes on as well. And I want to touch on one more thing that you mentioned, that is the feeling of scale, right? Like you're, a 20-year-old individual, you haven't really seen the world as much, but all of a sudden you're in a position where your code can touch just an unimaginable number of people, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to know how those feelings sort of were like in your mind as you were developing your work ethic in this plane.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. There was definitely this notion of, I would say two things. One is the scale, of course, like billions of people already at that point, billions of people were being impacted by the products and services that Facebook ran. At that point, they had just acquired Instagram like a year ago. Um, but I think even more than that, I think what Facebook did really well, and this is still true today, is they had formalized or codified their culture in a way that was very easy for people to pass along and understand.
Hmm.
So compared to any other internship I had, things like move fast and break things, done is better than perfect. This journey is 1% complete. I still remember these kind of core tenets of Facebook culture, and I feel like there was a respect of those cultural pillars because it felt like they are what enabled Facebook to become so hugely successful. And so that kind of increased all the interns. They're like, oh my gosh, if it
Hmm.
clearly it worked at Facebook, if I do that, I will also succeed in the same way, or I'll go off and do my own thing, my own startup, which will also succeed in the same way. There's almost this like
Hmm.
blind faith that, okay, Facebook's success came from these cultural pillars that were laid out in front of you. And so I feel
Hmm.
like it was just a deep respect for the scale at which you were operating. Like hundreds of millions of people could be impacted by this line of code you're writing. And also this cultural belief that, these are the traits that are a bit contrarian, frankly, like move fast and break things. That's
Hmm.
purposefully like bucking the system and like purposefully saying something
Hmm.
controversial. And you're part of that. I don't want to say cult, but you're part of that counterculture that
Hmm.
gives you the permission to do things in a little bit of a abnormal way. And it was actually quite empowering. And so I felt like,
Hmm.
it was very fun and very easy to get drunk on that feeling.
Hmm. And it's also really interesting to see it, the meta of it, not Facebook meta, but the meta Silicon Valley type of seeing companies do things so differently. Like Apple has its own way of doing things. Then Google came around, and it was the punk rock version of Apple, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is a very different environment. Everything's open. Everybody's collaborating. Very flat management. And then Facebook come in and sort of like do their own punk rock version on top of that, and to see that where it is today.
And actually,
It's good. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just one. I mean, that's a really good point. I think one thing that's worth commenting on there is that I actually don't know. I actually feel pretty strongly. There's no such thing as a correct culture. But what I will say
Totally.
is that having a culture is the important thing in my mind. Because like
Hmm.
if I contrast my 2013 internship at Facebook versus any of the prior internships, I think the big delta for me was the fact that Facebook actually had a really, really well-defined culture with posters on the wall that in like 4 or 5 words you could tell, okay, this is a Facebook poster enumerating or documenting what Facebook stood for in a way that I interned at a company called Marin Software, which is basically like a abstraction layer over different types of ads platforms, and it really didn't. I couldn't tell you like what is their
Hmm.
culture, and I feel like that was a big
Hmm.
issue, that there was no real cohesion or sense of belonging because I'm sure they had like generic values, but the fact that they didn't
Hmm.
have a cohesive sense of culture, that was a big failure. Not that, okay, Facebook versus Apple culture, which was better or worse, but the fact that Facebook and Apple have these cultures that me and you can talk about and debate, that actually is a
Hmm.
huge win for these companies.
Oh, totally. And it does have this like loyalty building effect too. And like you start incorporating them into your identity. And so it's really interesting. And I wanted to also ask you the difference between internships and full time, because I had the experience of, so I had my first internship sophomore year, then junior year, and then I went full time. So I felt I was a repeat intern and I thought I knew everything. I thought like, oh, I get how it all works now. And then I was, went through it as a full time employee, and that was surprisingly there were many more layers of complexity and navigating the environment as a full time employee than I
Yeah.
was expecting as an intern. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how that changed for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very different. So in my case in particular, it was very different because after I had done this big tech internship, I felt like I had finally, going back to the previous discussion, I felt like I had finally arrived in the sense that, okay, now I have Stanford, I have Facebook,
Mm.
I've got a couple internships, I can do whatever I want. And so I made the decision to actually join a, I was a founding engineer at a startup, which actually didn't it didn't actually pan out the way I wanted, but it got acquired by Pinterest. We can talk about that later. So, but I
Mm.
will say there was a huge difference in between an internship, which is very uh, segmented, right? It's like there's a very clear
Mm.
end date to your internship compared to a full time where there's not. You don't really talk about, okay, I'm going to be on this full time job for a year or 2 years. Like you don't think that way, or most companies don't think
Mm.
that way, and so um, that that leads to a huge mentality shift for the employee and also the company. Like there's a funny expression that a former manager of mine told me, which is that when you're an engineer for 3 months or even a year, you are able to ship code and see the impact of it. When you're an
Mm.
engineer for 2 years is when you're able to ship code and then also see the damage that you've caused. So like you're
Mm.
actually able to stick around long enough to say, hey, there's actually a maintenance burden. There's like a refactoring that has to be done. There's bug fixing that has to be done. And you don't actually see that if you are only doing an
Mm.
internship, right? You don't see the full life cycle of software development until you've actually stuck around on the same team or same org for, I would say, at least 6 months or maybe a year, right?
Mm.
And so I feel like that was one big change of you can't just work on the shiny new thing of shipping code because that's what interns will typically do. But there's going to be some expectation of on call, of giving feedback to other engineers, of design documentation, things like that that come into play and become actually very important the more senior you become. That are not really at all in the mind space of most engineers as an intern.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me too was the how it goes from you get assigned projects early on in your career as a very junior engineer, and then you start picking the projects a
Yeah,
little bit further into your career, and then eventually you start creating projects, right? Um, and and I was surprised at how quickly the getting assigned to picking projects thing happened. I think I thought that would take a bit of a longer time, but there's a lot of complexity in that decision in picking the right project to work on, right? At least at Google, there was a sense that every layer of the organization was making 1,000 different bets, little bets on different initiatives to improve certain metrics, right? And your manager will give you like a buffet of like, these are 3 or 4 ideas that I'm considering as bets. Which one do you pick? And so you're also effectively betting with your career, right? Like which one is going to work out and which one. But anyway, maybe put a pin on that before we go to the experience of being Acqui-hired. And then, I want to hear
Yeah.
how we come back to this point, through your story.
Yeah. So the Acqui-hired story, right? I think that was really interesting. A lot of ups and downs, because what happened is, okay, I had actually gone through the full recruiting cycle in my last year, my 5th year at Stanford, and I was prepared to, in fact, to join Google. That was actually
Hmm.
my intention.
Hmm.
But then I was actually working in a lab during my 5th year, my co-term year at Stanford is what we call it, and I was doing research with a professor who ended up taking some of the academic work we had done and spinning it out into a startup.
Hmm.
And there's actually not that uncommon at Stanford, because Stanford is
Hmm.
actually very generous with their faculty going out and starting companies. But what's really interesting is that there's this gray area of what is acceptable versus not acceptable for someone in a position of authority, like a professor, to go out and basically poach students,
Hmm.
right? Because as a 22-year-old
Right.
or 21-year-old, which I was, um, this person who you respect deeply, who's pretty famous in the field that you're spending hours and hours every day studying, he approaches you and says, "Hey, I think you'd be a great fit for my company." It's pretty hard to say no to that, right? you,
Hmm.
you can't really say no. And so, um, of course, I said, "Yeah, I'm. Tell me more. I would love to understand how you're thinking about this. What's the market opportunity? Like, what would I help with? What could I do?" And he had all the right answers, and I committed pretty late into my co-term year, so I backed out of Google and I ended up joining this company. And I don't want to say that I was a victim here, but I definitely, like, I was excited. I was like, wow, this is a great opportunity, someone I really respect. um, and so I joined that company shortly after I graduated. um, but what happened, I think, was building a startup is hard. I mean, it's easy to say that, right? But I think that we all realized very quickly that, okay, actually building a product, selling the product, and like building a marketing function around it, it's not just academic work anymore. We're actually doing something which requires way more people and skills than just what our founding team had. And so very quickly, within 6 months, because the professor was fairly well known, Pinterest actually came out and said, "Hey, we'd love to acquire you." And we didn't even have that much of a product yet, right? We'd only been doing this for 6 or 7 months. But because it was just like a hot company, Pinterest, offering relatively good terms, the professor and the leadership team said, "Yeah, let's go ahead and do it." And so it ended up being okay, because I was able to actually interview. I had to interview again, and that was kind of
Hmm.
stressful. Like 1 weekend to
Hmm.
prepare for this full on-site interview. Um, and I got the offer, thankfully. But it was actually quite stressful, not only because I felt like I was actually quite borderline on the offer. Like, Pinterest wasn't sure if they wanted to actually hire me, because they really wanted to hire the CEO and the professor and the leadership team. Um, but the second reason why it was not ideal from my perspective is because I made a deliberate choice when I graduated that, okay, I'm going to turn down the bigger company and really pursue this earliest stage company I could find, to learn
Hmm.
and build that experience and build that network. And I felt like it ended prematurely.
Hmm.
So within a few months, what I thought would have been a multi-year journey where I could learn a lot and like build something and maintain something, it ended after 6 months. And so it
Hmm.
took me a while, honestly, to get to terms with that and say, hey, this
Hmm.
is something that happened, and I have to either be on board or I have to leave, and I have to go back effectively and see if Google can still hire me or figure out the next
Hmm.
option. But once I kind of figured that out, and I said, okay, might as well make the most of this situation, I ended up joining Pinterest, and I ended up being there for about 2.5 years.
Hmm. And out of curiosity, who was the professor?
It was Yuri Leskovich.
Nice. I had a suspicion because I knew he ended up at Pinterest, and he's a prolific poacher. in the
Yeah.
best way. And I have like I think two or three other friends who followed the same path in a different startup now.
Yeah.
Um, and um, okay, so then you're at Pinterest, and at some point, I know you make the jump back to Facebook. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, that one was much more organic. I had been at Pinterest for 2.5 years. And I think at that point, I felt like I did truly see that full cycle of software development where I came
Hmm.
in on this new product called shopping, which didn't exist. And then throughout my time there, the team that I was on, we built it out. It actually didn't do that well. So then we kind of pivoted, we shipped something new. And I kind of just got to a point where, okay, I don't really see this product that I'm working on as a huge, huge priority for the company. I also don't see it 10xing the way that
Hmm.
we had hoped when we initially launched. Um, so that was one element. The other element was like in terms of the company as a whole. I remember when I joined Pinterest in like late 2014, early 2015. The idea, like the narrative, was that Pinterest is like a hot company. It should probably IPO in the next like year or two. And then
Hmm.
I stuck around for a year or two and did an IPO. And at that point, again, they said, yeah, it'll probably IPO in the next year or a year and a half. And it didn't. And then it actually didn't end up IPOing until like April of 2019, I believe. And so, when I did leave in 2017, at that point, I had heard this again and again of like, oh, Pinterest is about to
Hmm.
IPO. I was like, okay, I don't want to play this game anymore. I don't want to like be held hostage here, waiting for an IPO. Not that it would really have mattered in terms of like I was already vesting all my stock and everything. So it's not like financially it would have been a big difference, but it is special to be part of a company which is IPOing.
Hmm.
But that was another thing. Is like I got to the point in my time at Pinterest, it was like, hey, well, I don't need to stick around for this magical moment that everyone keeps talking about. I should just do what is best for me and my career. And so
Hmm.
that happened in 2017. I finally kind of decided to make the jump, and I did a pretty broad search. I got like I think 6 job offers, and I ended up joining Facebook, now known as Meta.
Hmm. Um, it's fantastic. I think like I'm just excited to get to the rest of this conversation because it's going to fit everything so perfectly. So you're at Facebook. You're now a full time engineer, and now once again you're sort of like now you're a proper citizen of the company that moves fast and breaks things. What
Yeah.
were some of the realizations as you were beginning your journey there in terms of like team dynamics, in terms of org structures and reorging and the more of the political side of these big organizations and you having to navigate that too?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say like my experience is probably a bit unique because I was pre-allocated. So normally when you go into Facebook, you're part of this thing called boot camp, which is a 6-week period where you get to learn the code base, learn the development tooling, and then you talk to a bunch of different hiring managers and you figure out where are you a good fit. And you rank teams and teams will rank you and then you kind of get assigned. In my case, that didn't happen. I was pre-allocated to a team called Building 8, which was a hardware division of Facebook. And so I did have boot camp, but it was a shorter version. I think it was a 4-week version of boot camp where I just learned the kind of development part of it. But I knew exactly where I would end up. So a lot of I would say, I don't know if you would call it political, but a lot of the initial parts of like the anxiety or like understanding of the org happens in boot camp, which I actually was able to avoid because I knew where I was going to go.
Hmm.
I think there was still an interesting element here of Building 8, which ended up shipping a product called Portal, a hardware video calling device. There was still a very interesting dynamic there because Facebook was relatively new at hardware. Like it had done
Hmm.
something called the Facebook phone back in the day, which failed. Um, and they had acquired Oculus, which at that point it was still unclear if it would work out. And so with Building 8, they actually had a different protocol where they actually made an entirely different, literally a different set of buildings on campus. And normal employees at Facebook didn't have access to go to the Building 8 building. It actually wasn't called Building 8. It was
Oh.
a different building, but it was like a different set of buildings. And so I think culturally we were quite different. Number one, because we were shipping hardware. So
Hmm.
the need to stick to timelines was much more important compared to like shipping a mobile app, which, okay, if I miss a deadline, ship it in the next release, it's not a big deal. But also because it was culturally different types of people attracted to that org, it had a different protocol, and like you can't share information with other employees. Only people who really needed to know about the project could get looped in. And so I very quickly started to see that, hey, there's a different idea here of what openness and transparency means in building my new team, versus like my friends who are part of, what I would call Facebook core.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. I mean, like it's basically it's basically a combination of Facebook culture, Google X, and Apple secrecy, uh, basically all tied up into one. And okay, so in a hardware org, but I'm guessing you still are like some of the core protocols are still there, like performance reviews and peer reviews and that type of stuff. So what did it feel like? Well, this is actually just for anybody who is considering going into industry, just like that feeling of the first, at Google it was called perf. I don't know what it's called at Facebook, but the first, okay, I have to prove myself moment. What was that like?
Yeah. So at Facebook, it's called PSC, Performance Summary Cycle. And it is daunting because I think what happens at Facebook, and I think this is actually getting more and more common now, is that you actually get a rating assigned to you.
Hmm.
So, like when I was at the startup and when I was at Pinterest, I think you did get some rating behind the scenes, but it was never told to you as the employee. And so, generally, what would happen is most people at Pinterest would just be told, "You're doing a good job, keep it up." But you didn't
Mm.
really know what that meant, aside from like, if you were going to get picked, like on a performance improvement plan, or if you're going to get fired, yeah, you obviously hear about that. But the majority of employees, they would just be told, "Yeah, good job, like keep it up." Whereas at Facebook, I think that they took it to a much more transparent outcome where they would actually give you a rating. At the bottom, it would be like meet some, MS, like meet some expectation. Average rating would be meets all, MA. And then if you did really well, you would get something called a GE, like a greatly exceeds expectation rating. And every 6 months, you would get one of these buckets. I think it was like 6 buckets. And
Mhm.
so there was no ambiguity. I'm like, oh yeah, like, are you doing well? How well are you doing? Tell me the rating that you got, right? And your manager had to have that conversation with you face to face. And so I feel like that level of transparency made it pretty nerve wracking as a new employee, because you wanted to make sure that you were actually stacking up and meeting the expectation, like getting at least an MA meets all expectation rating. And so that took some adjusting, and it required a lot of coordination with my manager. And happy to talk about like what that looked like. But it basically required a lot more kind of diligence on what does it even mean? What are expectations defined as?
Mhm.
And how do I benchmark myself against those expectations?
And that goes to a secondary point. I think it's very similar to how it happened at Google. I think it's like consistently meets expectations
Yeah.
is like the very baseline, or needs improvement is the worst one, the one you really don't want to be at. But I think it's five, and the top one is superb. But
Yeah.
the middle grade, the thing that everybody's expected to be at, is exceeds expectations. So everybody's supposed to be exceeding expectations all the time. And you're right. And it begs the question: what are the expectations? And there's a document that has the job ladder description of what your role is supposed to look like, but it's still implemented very differently across teams. And like the types of code interventions required are different. The types of people intervention required are different. And then you do have to adopt this more tactical approach to who you start socializing your work with. Who do you want to
Yep.
get in the loop? Whose support you want to get? You want to make sure that you're sort of like building this narrative, so that 6 months later you can build a story of like, hey, like these are all the challenges that we faced, and this is how we overcame them, and this is how I'm already proving to you that I'm above the expectations that I'm setting, in a context where I will also say that like the imposter syndrome is incredibly high, I think, for everybody. So everybody's sort of like feeling this sense of like, I have to prove myself to the smartest group of people that I've ever worked with,
Yeah.
and they legitimately are the smartest people ever. Um, so yeah, and how is going through that process like, successfully or unsuccessfully?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think about this a lot because the company I'm running today, Taro, its intention is exactly about how do we help engineers not screw it up, like actually
Mm-hmm.
do as well as they possibly can in this performance review promotion process. And I think, I think the negative framing of that is, there is some element of like posturing and politicalization. And I think there is some truth to that. But I think the positive interpretation is that there are some best practices that help you become a better teammate, a better engineer overall. And if we can just disseminate and communicate those best practices, I feel like not only will you become a better engineer, but you actually will become a higher performing engineer that will
Mm-hmm.
reflect in this cycle, in this, performance process, which is trying to capture in an imperfect way what does it mean to be a good engineer, because it's not going to be a perfect
Mm-hmm.
representation of the most ideal engineer, right? That's kind of impossible to do, but I think there are ways to understand that and then use that knowledge to actually help you become more confident and also get a better rating. So I would say that the number one mistake I see when it comes to, and this is something that I did, is that
Mm-hmm.
most companies are pretty good at documenting what does it mean to meet expectations or exceed expectations at a certain role. But I think the biggest mistake that engineers make is assuming how does that manifest for my team, for my role, where I'm situated. And they come in and say, okay, a senior engineer is supposed to be able to independently tackle problems and write the code to implement the solution. I say, okay, I get it. Like, let me go do that. And then I assume that I hit that benchmark. But only when I talk to a tech lead or another peer or my manager do I then discover that actually their interpretation of that statement for my role, for my level, is completely different from what I
Mm-hmm.
actually interpreted that to be. So I think that's actually the biggest, by far, the biggest mistake that I see is that people are so stuck in their heads and they're almost afraid, or they maybe not afraid, but they are kind of they're assuming way too much
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to what does it mean to be an adequate or a top performer, because it really is contextual. Like
Yeah.
I would I would argue that you cannot make that judgment on your own. The definition of what it
Mm-hmm.
means to be an adequate performer is it's defined by your peers, by your manager. And so the fact that you think you can do it on your own is actually a sign that you probably don't quite know that yet, because it has to come from a wisdom of the crowds process.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're touching on another thing that I felt very fortunate in my experience is like developing this really strange method of communication with your manager, where you're being very honest about your intentions and your goals, and their intentions and their goals, while still under the relationship of manager and report, right? Um, and fortunate, I had the very fortunate experience of having managers who were always very coachy in their approach to the process and engineering as a career. But I have also heard of friends who did not have the same experience, and so it does require a bit more on the part of the report to to build rapport in the right way
Yeah.
with the manager. But before we get into Taro stuff, which I'm excited to like properly geek out about, at some point in this journey, you also, I think there was must have, I'm hypothesizing, but there's a moment of self reflection there where you realize that your experience, having gone through all of these experiences, um, very canonical tech experiences that were unique to the world, because being a part of it, you don't feel it's unique in the sense that everybody around you is going through them, but in the context of the world, it is incredibly unique.
Mhm.
And you decided to start sharing that with the world through
Yeah.
content, right? What was that journey like of, the light bulb moment of like, maybe my life is worth sharing, the experiences that I have are worth sharing. And how did that journey go on?
Yeah, that was a long, long journey that literally started from Stanford days. Like, me and you, we
Mm,
were both in a section leading program where we taught some of the intro computer science courses at Stanford. That was, I think, my first real commitment to teaching and enjoying that
mm,
process of helping people. And so since I got into industry, probably 2015, 2016, I was teaching in some capacity. There was an organization called CodePath, a nonprofit, which helped university students learn mobile development. Because within a few years of being in the industry, I started doing Android development. And so
Mhm.
through them, I taught a bunch of people Android. And they had a model even before the pandemic where they would deliver a lot of the content remotely. And the actual time you would have together would be more interactive and more exercise based. And
Mhm.
so what I discovered was that I was not good at like manipulating video or doing a tutorial online. But despite my inexperience, like I would put together a tutorial, like a walkthrough, a tutorial of some random Android app, and people got tons and tons of value from it through CodePath. Where I would get comments on the video in the way that CodePath hosted it, saying, "Wow, this is an amazing walkthrough. Thanks so much."
Mhm.
And so that I think was a light bulb moment for me that even though I never considered myself as a online instructor, I could do that too. And
Hmm.
that was when I started to actually think of, okay, how do I invest in some editing software? How do I get a better audio setup? Like what actually makes a good online tutorial? And so for the first maybe 2 years of my online creation journey, it was actually just uh, making tutorials for Android. So that was the
Mhm.
genesis of my YouTube video. Like the first, if you look at the YouTube video, the YouTube channel history, um, the first probably year or year and a half was just literally me walking through different parts of the Android platform and how you could use it as a developer. And then
Mhm.
only after a year and a half where I started to feel like, okay, I get it, and I have found some level of success in Android, then I started to branch out into more career content. And I found that
Mhm.
people actually like gravitated toward that a lot more. And that
Mhm.
was really where, it took off from there. And that there was a transition from there into actually starting to pursue education full time. And that was where Taro came
Mhm.
from.
But there's so it's one thing I want to say, like me in the very beginnings of my journey. It's one thing to sort of start getting in the flow, but it is a lot of mechanical work. Like there's a lot of there's the planning, there's the sequencing, there's the scheduling, there's the actually conducting and filming, recording. There's the mechanical light stuff. There's I mean layers on layers of the stuff. So I was wondering like you were doing this while you were working full time. What was the thing that was motivating you as you were beginning the journey um, to go through this amount of work? Because at least it's a part time job on top of your job, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's a good question. I'm trying to think. I mean, I think part of it was that I was a student of CodePath initially. So I actually this organization that I'm talking about called CodePath,
Mm.
I took both their Android and iOS courses, and that was like really instrumental in my transition from a back-end machine learning engineer into mobile. And so I felt there was some level of gratitude or indebtedness that I had to them as being the trailblazer to helping me transition. And I thought that okay, this they did it for me. I would love to pay it forward. And um, honestly, it was more of an excuse to hang out with the founders and like get their
Mm.
feedback because like they were very involved in the company still. Um, and I think once I started doing it, another motivation also came into effect, which was the fact that I felt like I could actually do better than a lot of the other tutorials out there.
Mm.
And maybe that's not like a good, like completely, um, what's the term? Like it's like an unsightly motivation in some ways, like competitive nature. But I felt like, when I looked on YouTube, a lot of the other tutorials, number one, were either outdated, right? Because Android mobile development as a field changes so rapidly. Like the things that you
Mm.
find
Mm.
5 years ago on YouTube or on Stack Overflow are likely not relevant to a mobile developer today because 5 years in mobile development world, the whole platform has shifted beneath you, right? The other thing is that a lot of the tutorials were just like literally a screen capture with really horrible audio or no audio at all, and
Mhm.
someone just doing something on screen. I felt like I knew that I could do better
Mhm.
in terms of delivering higher value, higher density content that could actually help people follow along and not just fix the issue that people are having, but explain why. And I felt like there
Mhm.
was some element of me which is like, okay, I want to give back to CodePath, and it's a lot of work to do that. But also, I do think that I can actually deliver a better product compared to what
Mm.
most people out there are being exposed to. And I would love to play a part in up leveling this whole online
Mhm.
education tutorial space for mobile developers.
No, and I also want to comment on the fact that you said, the competitive spirit, as in, it may not be the right reason to think about it. But I think I disagree. I think, like, if you see low hanging fruit in terms of your ability to impact the world in a positive way at the scale of the internet, I think, like, this is a value to all the people who valued that over the previous offering. And
Yeah.
not to, who everybody's just building on top of the thing that came before. So, the videos that you sort of outcompeted were probably outcompeted even worse videos before, right? So I think, like, there's the way of looking at it, and I kind of also am really been interested in exploring, like, these cases where there's a synergy between a market mismatch and somebody's personal predispositions. This is exactly what happened in your case, right? Um, and what was the moment when you shifted, when you went from sort of like the dev crowd and like dev training to more like, okay, tailor the audience to engineers in the Bay, or engineers thinking about how engineering is done in the Bay, and their career paths?
Yeah. Okay. I would say there was kind of two trigger points that led to that transition. The first transition point was kind of what we just talked about, which is the breakneck pace of change in mobile development. I remember in 2021, Android Studio came out with a big update, which moved some of the UI around. So I forget exactly
Mm,
what it was, but I think like the run button to like actually deploy
mm.
your application, build it and deploy it on the emulator or on the phone, it like moved around.
Because it was the
Um,
IntelliJ update. Is that what it was?
well, it was Android Studio, which was already based on IntelliJ at this point, but it was like
Mm,
a version update that
mm,
led to UI changing, and it was like confusing enough because at this point I'd actually like started teaching at Stanford and I was like doing some other things. It was confusing enough that um so basically like the way I thought about it was all of my tutorials up until now have become about 10% more confusing because now like people are going to look at the
mm.
tutorial and be like, okay, well here's the button that he clicked, and I look at my Android Studio and it's not the same button. So like
Mm.
there's this added cognitive load, and just for that one thing, if you can't, it's not easy to just go in and surgically replace that. You have to basically redo the whole thing.
Rewrite the entire video. Yeah,
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 there's other changes too. Like, okay, this one method call got deprecated. You can still use it, but now Android
yeah.
Studio would show you like a strike through it to like encourage the developer to like upgrade to a new thing. And so it just like it felt to me like, okay, I enjoyed it and I learned a lot in the teaching process. But in order for me to continue to add value, I'm going to have to spend like half of my time basically keeping up to date all of my previous tutorials. And it just felt like I was on a treadmill of like continuing to keep
Mm,
things up to date rather than innovating or adding more content into the world. And frankly, that's still
mm,
a problem, right? Like if you look at technology YouTubers or people who are focused on the cutting edge, like news YouTubers, like the fact of the matter is that if you're a YouTuber talking about the news, if you are dormant for a month or a year, you're basically done. Like no one really
mm,
like your relevance to the world is tied to you being the first person to report on this news article. And that's not
mm,
as aggressive, not as aggressively true in the world of you know, mobile development or technology because like there's
mm,
some leeway and like some deprecation window. But if you just let your channel stay there, it will decay over a year or 2 years or 3 years to a point where it just won't be as relevant. That was a big kind of motivating factor. And the other motivating factor is that I had gotten the YouTube channel to a point where I wasn't a tiny channel anymore. I think I had gotten to
mm,
maybe 25 or 30,000 subscribers. And at that point, I had gotten some inbound from other developers who saw my channel and wanted to do some sort of collaboration. And it's actually fairly common in
mm,
the YouTube world. And so there's one collaboration in particular with a fairly large YouTuber, Clement, who I went on his channel and I talked about my experience being a staff engineer at Meta. And that video
mm,
did really astonishingly well. I think like 100,000 views within a few weeks, which was, by my
mm,
standards, it was like mind blowing. It's like, oh my gosh, it's like everyone has seen this video. And so I feel like that was another kind of light bulb moment, which is that, hey, there's actually perhaps an even bigger market when it comes to this other content, which is much more career focused. And by the
mm.
way, that is much more evergreen. Like it's not going to decay or die in a year the way that my tutorial video might have. So the combination of those two things really led me to start to do a lot more content in the career area.
And how do those YouTube collaborations work? Like, so it's not just a collaboration; it's kind of like a cross-genre collaboration, right? Like this is like somebody from a different space that reached out to your audience. Um, um, how do those things happen? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the idea with collaborations is that you try and make it a win-win because you're sharing audiences and exposing your
Mm,
audience to this new creator who they might find enjoyable, and likewise, you get to
mhm,
hopefully tap into the audience, tap into the audience of this other creator who you might appeal to, right? So this person I'm
mhm,
talking about in particular, he was in the interview prep space. So if you're an
mm,
engineer
mhm,
preparing for like your data structure algorithm interview at Amazon or
mhm,
Google or Microsoft or whatever, then he had a company which would help you prepare for that. And so there was like these collaborations are really interesting because you want it to be if you have like 1,000 subscribers and the other person has 100,000, there's no real value in a collaboration for the
mm,
bigger person, right? Like it's hard to make it a win-win. And similarly, if you're both the same size, but you're in the exact same space,
mm.
it's also not really a win-win because you're actually kind of cannibalizing each other or competitive with each other.
Yeah.
And so I feel like with Clement, I was actually significantly smaller than him. I think I had like 25,000 subscribers and he had probably 200,000. So he was quite a bit bigger.
Mm,
But I think the value I was able to provide him was that of a very senior engineer in big tech. And most of the audience that he had, or most of the other people who he had on his channel, were not that senior. And so it was a combination of me having somewhat of an audience along with my unique experience. I went
mhm,
onto his channel and then he went onto my channel. And that led to this really big kind of increase in audience for me, at least.
mhm. And then it was off to the races. I feel like I have only the I can imagine I would go search one of your earlier videos, Android videos, compared to the style format, thumbnail, title of your current videos, and there's a stylistic evolution there from doing this for the educational value of the thing. In the case of development, it makes sense because it's so technical, right? Um, but now it seems to me that there are all these other layers of optimization and engagement that you've deployed that I think are like the keys when you're at your level, right? Like when you're trying to get from, I'm guessing like 30 to what is like 85K now.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
what
I think
what
that's
what is that process? Because that's like an energetic, creative energy that is deployed somewhere has to start going here. What was that trigger or what was that moment like?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess like just to complete the like to up until today. So after that collaboration happened, like shortly thereafter, I started to become much more aggressive about like, hey,
Mm,
this is something that I think there's a need for, and I started to make more content there. And as I made that shift from just a technology YouTuber who made tutorials into me talking about my own journey and talking to other people about their journey and what career success looked like, I felt less and less comfortable doing that within the bubble of Meta. I didn't want to be just
mm,
a representative of the company, especially if I was still getting a paycheck from them. I felt like my first and foremost priority should be let me be a good employee and not try and leverage my current employment in my company. And so that was really, I
mm,
think, a big part of okay, in 2022 January, I quit, and now it's okay. Now I'm going to be a full time. Um, I'm going to try and create a company around this. And when I create a
mm,
company around it, it now becomes imperative to actually get eyeballs and a top of funnel to
mm,
get people to care about your product, like whatever you end up building.
mhm,
And we did that in tandem. Like we actually, I
mhm,
started to think about the YouTube strategy and the content even before we had a product. Just felt like
mm,
we knew generally what kind of audience we wanted, and I kind of I decoupled them. Like on one hand, I wanted to build the content that developers would really resonate with. And at the same time, in parallel, I also wanted to develop a product that would actually retain them and get them to hopefully add enough value that they could pay for it, right? But
mhm,
I tried to view them as like separate things altogether. And so, to your point, yeah, I think there was a pretty deliberate effort in that transition period, like from 2021 up until 2022, when I actually left my job. I went through a pretty big transformation, and this is no longer a hobby, and it's now a business imperative that I actually
mm,
create content which is going to have tons of value for people, and it's going to be engaging enough that they actually click on it. Right, out of the
mhm,
millions and millions of content and videos and articles that are out there on the internet, why would someone choose 10 minutes of their life on my video? And
mm,
I tried to be a lot more um, kind of prescriptive about why are they clicking on this video. And that comes down to, okay,
Mm.
title, thumbnail, hook, like all these things that I didn't really think
Mhm.
about that much as an educational YouTuber. I started to think about a lot more. And that I think did lead to, some good increases in watch time and view counts and things like that after I had left the company.
But that's also, I don't want to minimize the decision there to jump, take the leap, invest in yourself, believe in what you're doing, sort of like, that this is what you want to do. You found like your I don't know, want to say calling, but at least like the next chapter of your life, and deciding to do that. Like, what was going through that, the moment when you send the email, like, thank you for everything, this is give my 2 weeks or 3 weeks notice. What was going through your mind then when you were like, I'm
Yeah.
I'm sending it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot was going through my mind. I feel like, honestly, more than anything, I feel like it was actually, I felt like I waited too long. And I think you probably will hear
Mm.
that from many entrepreneurs who are like, it sounds scary and it's a big decision to leave. But I would say among almost all my entrepreneur friends, they all wish they could have started a little bit sooner. And I think that's probably true for me too. I don't know if I needed to wait. I don't think I needed to wait so long until 2022 to actually quit my job. I probably could have done it a little bit sooner. I think,
Mm.
for me, I'm like a very planned out person. So
Mm.
I like wrote down a bunch about like, here's exactly why I'm quitting, and here's the reason why I'm quitting today and not last year or not next year. And so it wasn't, it certainly, I'm like not an impulsive person at all. So like I had very clear reasons. I think a big part of it that I had been working in tech for a while at that point, right? I had done a
Mm.
startup, I had done interest, I had done Meta. So I feel like I had kind of seen the whole gamut of like what there was to offer, and I felt like I could share that with people. Secondly, I had a fallback option, which is I already had somewhat of an audience built out that I felt like
Mhm.
could guide me. I wasn't starting off as a blind entrepreneur. I felt like I already
Mm.
had some element of market pull. I mean, it wasn't like I'm for sure going to get $1 million a year, but I felt like, hey, there are people out there who care about this and will give me feedback to point me in the right direction. And the third thing was I feel like I had worked long enough where I didn't, I wasn't like rich, but I didn't need to work for a while. And I think
Mhm.
that financial freedom, at least for a few years, where like I had saved up a bunch of money for working that long. I think
Mhm.
that, I mean, money is optionality. That's what I think about, right?
Totally.
And so once I had been working in the industry for about 9 years at that point, or 10, yeah, 9 years, I feel like it gave me the chance to, not have that pressure for at least, I did
Mm.
the math. Like there was like a 2 or 3 year period where I didn't have to make
Mhm.
any, and I still wouldn't have had to worry about finances. And that gave me some flexibility that, okay, I can do it now. I don't have to
Mhm.
stress out that component of my life.
No, it's fascinating to me. I like, one of the things that I've been really interested in is like the intersection of all the things that have to go right, for bravery to emerge.
Yeah.
And and it's a weird kind of bravery. I think like you were in a position where you already had momentum, but you were also very exploratory in the phases of Taro, which is now a full-on company. It's like a super validated company. Talk about like a credential that you want to have for a company, going through YC. Um, and okay, let's talk about Taro a little, because I want to evoke this theme of endurance that I think like you've just like exemplified throughout this, like enduring these changes, enduring building an audience, enduring sort of starting from zero and building to one. Okay, so let's talk about Taro and like how that becomes the ultimate self reflection of the whole story we've been talking so far.
Yeah. I mean, so the idea with Taro is actually really simple, right? Like the idea that, hey, you're an engineer. How can we increase the collective impact of engineers around the world? Software engineers around the world, they're going to become more and more and more important in the coming decade. And they're also going to become more powerful in the coming decades because of tools like AI, where you're going to have one engineer who
Mm-hmm.
can do the work today of 5 engineers or 10 engineers. One engineer might be able to do that in a few years from now, right? And so you not only will have more and more of the world run by software, you're going to have more engineers who are going to be more powerful. And so the idea with Taro is how can we help these engineers become more impactful, more confident, get paid more in the industry? And I think that it came out of me and my co-founders lived experience, right? Like we have seen through our almost 2 decades in industry collectively between us, there's so many things that that classic story of like, okay, if you could go back in time
Mm.
and tell yourself one thing when you were graduating from college, what would you have told them? I have a list of like 20 things I would have told myself back then. And if I had heard that list, I would have been a much happier, much richer, much better engineer, right? And so I think that's kind of the genesis of like what we're trying to like. That was the kind of in a nutshell what we're trying to do with
Mm.
Taro is like we capture all that, and then based on where you live, what level you are, how big your company is, what gender you are, all these things that matter to your career. Let's bundle all that information and find the correct, validated, verified information that will really help you contextually in your position. And if we can do that at scale, I feel like that's a pretty huge impact on the world.
No, it's a beautiful. The way you stated it was so beautiful. Like unlocking the collective potential, and the way that's phrased is a win-win for society as a whole. It's a great win for companies who want to improve their workforce. It's a great, in perfect alignment with engineers who want to do well in their organizations, but also want to fireproof themselves against whatever macroeconomic changes may happen. Um, and and I agree. I mean, like already in terms of leverage, code gives you so much leverage over reality. And as we have leverage over intelligence that is capable of coding, then and being able to combine those two things effectively and communicating effectively and coordinating effectively, um, it's also just I think a social imperative. I don't think it's just like a nice to have. I think like and so that's awesome. And where is Tara at now?
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting journey. So we founded the company technically in, I think it was February of 2022 or March of 2022. We incorporated. We we honestly didn't know how we would go about achieving the mission at all for the first few months. So I quit in January 2022. And I think for the first 2 or 3 months, we just had no idea what we were doing. Like we knew we wanted to do something to help engineers. We didn't know if that would manifest in terms of a B2B product, like selling a tool or a software solution to a company like Airbnb who would help their engineers, or would we sell directly to the Airbnb engineer, right? We actually had a
Mhm.
lot of debate for the first few months about
Mhm.
which way was better. So we ended up finally doing the B2C approach, like the direct to
Mm.
consumer, because we have those inroads already. We felt like
Mm.
we were the consumer ourselves, so we knew who we were building for. And secondly, we already had a decent amount of marketing muscle built out there with the YouTube channel, LinkedIn, etc. So we knew how to reach those people. And then once we made that decision, I feel like then we were able to very quickly build something which like validated the idea. We had a mobile app out within a few weeks, and that led to getting into Y Combinator. So we went through YC
Mm.
in the summer of 2022, so like June through September, and then that was actually really powerful because
Mm.
one of the things you learn in YC is that like launching is not a one-time event. Launching is something you do early and you do it often, right? Like you launch, ideally you launch like every week, every day even. You launch again and again and again. So rather than thinking about, oh, I need to wait until I have the perfect product and then I'll launch it, that's not the right mentality. Especially in
Mm.
software where the iteration speed is so low and it's so cheap and easy to deploy again and again. Why would you not launch every day, right? And so
Mm.
I think that was really powerful for us to think about. And so shortly after we got into Y Combinator, we actually did launch for the first time a paid product, which is actually how we're funding the company operations today. We have this direct to consumer membership product, and that unlocks a lot of content and events and meetup groups that we have
Mm.
on the platform. And so we've been doing that now for about a year. Like since summer 2022, we've been running this like paid membership program for about a year and a half. Most of the content on Taro is entirely free, but we do have
Mhm.
a meaningful portion of it paywalled for people in
Mhm.
Taro, along with like the more interactive components are also paywalled because we can
Mm.
guarantee some level of quality then. And so that's kind of how we've been operating for the past year. I think overall it's overall good. I mean, like I'm really happy, and I definitely every day I wake up I'm like, wow, I'm really engaged with the work in a way that I sometimes was not engaged in the same way
Hmm.
at Meta Interest. So we have around 50,000 engineers who are using the product in any given month, and we have
That's
more than 1,000
awesome.
who are like actively part of this membership program. So I think we've hit a scale which, if you had asked me, 10 years ago, I'd be like, wow, those are some pretty big numbers that you have. So
Mhm.
overall, going well.
And also, I want to modulate it by the fact that, like in general, we think of consumer products as being, um, I think of like the, stratospheric use case, success cases of like ChatGPT getting to 100 million users in a month. But this is a very different product, and it's for a very specific audience. And if you measure the size of that audience and the market that you're sort of addressing, that's already significant inroads. And in terms of let's say um, the cumulative net worth of the audience is also probably very different than a similarly sized audience that is in a different situation, right?
Yeah,
um,
you're totally right. I feel like one way to think about it is like, who are you actually pursuing, right? So for a tool like ChatGPT, literally anyone in the world could technically get value from it, right? And
right.
so that's why it's a huge success. But when you frame it, when you think about Taro, and this is where you can kind of play games with investors and other people, and like
Hmm.
how you define that market. But you could say, hey, we only care about engineers, but actually we
Hmm.
only care about engineers in North America. No, but actually we only care about software engineers in the Bay Area who are employed. And when you narrow it down more and more and more, you start to define a much kind of narrower population, obviously, but also it'll educate your product. And so I feel like
Mm.
having that really, really deep focus initially, at least, is quite powerful. And that's what we did. And then, yeah, of course, once you've really nailed that problem and you've figured out a solution for that initial audience, then you can always expand. But having that focus initially is really important.
Hmm. Um, Rahul, what are some tips you have for somebody who may be watching or listening to this that is either at some point in their engineering career, at some point in the founder's journey, at some point in the content journey, at some point in an educational journey, where they're constantly facing these changes, whether it be the economic landscape changes, the dev toolkit changes, the even internal energies and ways of interpreting oneself changes, so that they can find endurance to navigate the changes and hopefully thrive and eventually find the right alignment between their skills, um, actions, and impact.
Yeah. And a couple things come to mind. Um, the first is like my go-to piece of advice for anyone who's starting off in content creation or even in like building a company, which is that quantity over quality.
Hmm.
I think that the way you get good at something is just by doing it a lot. And I think that if you
Hmm.
hold yourself to a really high bar, like I'm only going to release this podcast or this video or this piece of code when I know it's perfect, then you'll never actually get it done, right? Because you
Hmm.
have such a high bar in your head. And so I tell people when they're starting out that if you have like a scale of 0 to 10, and 10 is like you nailed it, you feel really good about it, your goal should be to ship whatever you have when it's like a 6 or 7 out of 10. It's like if you've waited until it's a 9 out of 10, I would argue that you've waited too long. Like that's the
Hmm.
mistake. You've done something wrong. And so if you tell your brain that and you kind of reframe your thinking that way of like I want to ship, I want to launch when I hit 6 out of 10, I feel like you will ship a lot faster. And then over time, you'll find that your 6 out of 10 from, your 6 out of 10 6 months from now is going to be equivalent to a 9 out of 10, right? Of what
Hmm.
you think is a 9 out of 10. And so that's like the best way to get better. That's like one big piece of advice. And the other thing I would say is creativity requires trial and error.
Hmm.
And so the best way to build something meaningful or to achieve something is to do something. Like just literally do something, right? Like even if you think it's a mistake, or even if you don't really know what you're doing. Like for example, on Taro, our charter is so broad. Like we are trying to build a product which is going to be valuable for engineers. Does that mean that we are going to create videos? Are we going to do interviews? Are we going to do a Q&A
Mm.
forum? Are we going to do events? Are we going to do like an AI tool? Like, there's literally 100 different things that we could build. And I do think that the way I've thought about it is I actually don't want to be super analytical about it. I don't want to like do
Mm.
a huge pros and cons list of 100 different things we could do and then count to like have like a 1,000 point score sheet and then rank them. I would rather have some intuition about, hey, here are like 5 or 6 ideas that we think are promising and build them. Like go one at a time and build them and figure out the audience reaction to it. And that trial and error will spawn more ideas. And that spawning of more ideas will probably lead to one idea which is good. And so I think
Mm.
that it kind of is linked to the quantity over quality concept. But I
Mm.
think the more you're okay with trial and error, the more creative you can become. And the more creative you become, I think that's where you find large amounts of success.
Mm-hmm. Rahul, that is awesome. What a great way to end it with words of wisdom. I really appreciate your time, man. Thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, this is super fun for me. Thanks for hosting me, Christian. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed talking with you.